This is enablement training, part 1 of 2 for Hybrid Workspaces Application Streaming Server, covering the installation and configuration of the system. This course will cover Hybrid Workspaces Application Streaming Server installation and configuration. Feel free to download any course PDFs to follow along for reference. Be sure to watch part 2 of this series for troubleshooting of the application streaming server system. The presenter is a Turbo developer engineer, Oleg Somfane. This presentation is presented to a live audience, so there will be discussions and questions throughout the presentation. Let's begin.
Today we'll be covering the installation portion for Turbo Server, or for Micro Focus, it's branded as Hybrid Workspaces. There's a couple of slight differences, but essentially under the hood it's all Turbo Server. In part 2, we expect to go over server troubleshooting. All right, so let's get started. So installation. The Turbo Server you get from our website. For Hybrid Workspaces, you'll be getting the installer from the Micro Focus website. And you'd simply double-click the installer to begin the setup. The first step is to accept the EULA. Micro Focus has a separate EULA than Turbo. And then you'd enter the Turbo Server license. Going back to that, Micro Focus has a pre-configured license for 40 users that lasts 60 days. And then once your customer is done evaluating the product and they make a decision to buy, you would provide them with a retail license to put in. They're allowed to set a path for the installation folder. And sometimes I see customers needing to install Turbo Server on a separate drive, either because the main drive doesn't have enough space, or backup policy or some other policy requires that the software is installed on a separate drive.
Hey, Oleg, just really quick, once we start the installer, that's cool, but any comments about the platform to install on? Like, what should we do? What should we not do?
That will come after going over the installation process overview.
Oh, okay.
Yes. After selecting the installation folder, you will be prompted to select the server roles. The selection of the roles will depend on the scenario and the purpose of the Turbo Server environment. And again, we'll be covering this shortly. If you select the application role, you will be prompted to reboot the server, and this will happen automatically at the end. Now, one important thing to note here is that a lot of people, I guess, don't expect the reboot at the end. So that's something that is expected. And the application role is also included in the standalone option. You'll be able to select a URL for your portal. This defaults to the computer name. And this can be also changed later on from the administration portal if your DNS name for the server is not available at the time of the server installation. So it is safe to leave it as the computer name if you don't have a DNS name yet. You can also apply SSL certificates by switching the protocol on the left-hand side from HTTP to HTTPS. The certificates can also be added later on from the administration portal if they're not available right now. Farm installs, you will be required to configure a connection string for an external database, and that applies to both the configuration database and the analytics database. The standalone install uses an embedded database component, but you shouldn't really be using the standalone install for anything but demo or a testing environment. The installing user and the service user must have access to the database unless the credential is specified in the connection string. And the databases will be automatically created if the user has permissions to do so. If the user does not have permissions to create a database, it should be created in the database software separately. The supported databases include Azure SQL, Microsoft SQL Server, and Microsoft SQL Server Express. Selecting a service account is another step that's only shown for farm installs. It doesn't show up in standalone mode. In standalone mode, the service user is defaulted to the local system account. Customers typically will create a domain account for the service user. And again, this account must have access to the database specified in the connection string. This account must be an administrator level account on servers with the application role, but it doesn't have to be administrator on servers with the hub and portal roles. And finally, you're going to be prompted to configure a Turbo Server administration account. This is the initial Turbo Server account that will be used to configure Turbo Server until you set up SSO or an alternate authentication method. It can also be used as a break glass account in case your SSO or other authentication fails. After all of these prompts, Turbo Server will begin to install. Finally, you will see the setup complete. Now, if you start the installer and walk away, you'll notice that the system will have restarted for the RDS role if application role has been selected. Again, that's totally expected, so it's not an issue. For upgrades, Turbo Server may also prompt to restart for any pending Windows updates at this time. As I mentioned, for the hybrid workspaces variant, the installer will be downloaded from the Micro Focus website, and it includes the hybrid workspaces theme and branding. It's pre-configured with a license, and the default installation directory reflects the Micro Focus hybrid workspaces branding. Moving on. Here is where we go into the requirements. For all roles, you should have at least a 64-bit 2.5 gigahertz processor with 4 cores or better. The OS should be at least Windows Server 2012 R2 or Microsoft Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session, which is available in Azure. Memory should be at least 8 gigabytes or more. Again, these are the base system requirements. If you get a faster machine, the performance of Turbo Server will be faster. Additional requirements for the hub role include, well, let's go over what the hub role does. The hub role stores all of the application images and user session data. User session data is for any application that has cloud persistence setting enabled. And what that does is basically it synchronizes the data between the end user device or application server with the hub so that it doesn't matter where you run it from, you have the application settings follow your launches anywhere. What that means is that your memory will grow with the number and size of applications pushed to the server, as well as the number of users pulling applications from the server at the same time. It will also grow with the session persistence data that is stored on the hub server. A general rule of thumb, you need a minimum of 4 gigabytes of memory and 50 megabytes of memory per concurrent user. In typical environments, I see around 8 to 12 gigabytes allocated to the hub role. If it's a smaller environment, let's say maybe 100 users, you're probably safe with going with around 4 gigabytes of memory, unless you have some really big applications. The portal role. The portal hosts the application web portal. So when you go to type in the address for your Turbo Server, you will see the portal where you launch applications. The portal also has access to any cloud storage provider integrations and other Turbo resources. The memory usage grows with the number of streamed application connections. At a minimum, you would want 2 gigabytes of memory plus 50 megabytes per concurrent user. The application role handles the application execution for streaming. This includes any of the running cloud launch modes. The disk usage grows with the number and size of applications executed on the server, as well as the number and size of the user's containers. It's generally recommended to use an SSD for faster I/O to prevent bottlenecks. In addition, the server system must meet the hardware requirement for the applications. That means that there must be a sufficient processor and memory resources for the application to execute. And it must handle the number of users that are executing at the same time. It also includes additional requirements, such as if the application requires a graphics card for rendering, the service must have a compatible graphics card or other hardware module that the application may need. For licensing, you also need to configure RDS licensing, so CAUs, if you're using Turbo Server. Alternatively, if you're in Azure, you can use the Windows 10 or Windows 11 Enterprise Multi-Session Edition. I haven't planned to cover RDS configuration in this session. Generally, RDS licensing is considered part of Windows setup. Generally, the RDS licensing is handled by the customer. Some customers may need assistance with RDS configuration, but there are plenty of Windows documentation that you can reference for RDS configuration, as well as the ability to contact Microsoft support. In a lot of cases, the customer may have an assurance or a software assurance plan that has special provisions for licensing for them.
Installing it out of box, would we be able to do RDS licensing?
Yes.
Yeah.
You have, I believe, 120-day evaluation period when you set up a Windows Server machine. So it goes from the start of the Windows Server setup, not Turbo Server setup.
Very good, thank you.
There's also a way to reset the grace period. So if you have a testing environment and you've expired, you can look up how to reset the RDS grace periods. This is generally not used in a production environment, although I have had a couple of educational institutions come back and tell me that it's fine to have a periodic reset because their software assurance says that they're covered for any streaming connections. So it's not an issue for them. As long as Microsoft, says it's okay to do something, it's okay to do it that way. All right. So let's go over some scenarios. Let's say I want to spin up a quick demo, but I don't want to take up a lot of time setting up, the database server for Turbo Server and service account and whatever else I need. In that case, I'm going to go ahead and use the standalone installation option. In this case, all of the Turbo Server roles will be installed on the same machine. It will also use an internal database component, which is SQL Server Express instance that we've put in an SVM layer. This is very quick to spin up and show how Turbo Server works. It also allows you to have a test environment where you can quickly test features or applications before you push them to a production environment. The trade-off is that this setup typically results in slower performance because a single system has to do all of the roles for the Turbo Server as well as the application execution. So you should not use this for production environments or POC environments where the capacity and performance is important to be evaluated. For POC and production environments for up to 100 users, you should be using the farm installation option. You can set up a server with both the hub and the portal row in the same system to keep it simple. Or you can set up one server with the hub row and one server with the portal row separately. You'd also need to set up one or more separate servers for the application row with enough processing capacity or compute capacity to meet your application's requirements. The farm install will require an external database, so you should have that prepared, or the customer should have that prepared. And this will result in a faster performance and launch times than using the standalone option. And the primary factor for that is that the application execution is performed on a dedicated server that's separate from the hub and portal. If you have a large production environment or deployment, you should again use a farm installation option. You should set up a server with just the hub row and then a separate server for the portal row. If you have more than 300 users, you should set up a portal row for each 300 users. You should additionally set up separate servers for the application row to meet the application execution requirements. Again, this will require an external database, and you will need an external load balancer to balance the portals. Any questions? For estimating application requirements, typically we have found that an Azure D4S V3 instance can support about 20 concurrent sessions for standard Office-like or Microsoft Office-like applications in typical usage scenarios. This machine, it is a virtual machine, but it is on Microsoft's hypervisor, so it's not like a virtual box machine where you share with a normal desktop level class software. It has 4 virtual processors at 2.5 gigahertz, and it has 16 gigabytes of memory.
Hey, Oleg, I don't have a lot of Azure exposure, but I'm guessing a D4S V3 is a pre-built Windows template server.
The OS can be anything. It can be Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows Server. It's just a hardware specification for how many CPUs, memory there is, as well as certain I/O levels. It's important to note that more demanding applications such as AutoCAD, MATLAB, and Visual Studio can be estimated to count as 4 times the standard application because they're more computation heavy. Another thing to note is that there's a difference between simultaneous launches and concurrent sessions. Typically, when people use an Office application, they don't really use the CPU all the time. They might use it for limited periods of time. If they're launching an application, it will spike the processor and disk usage quite a bit during the launch. So generally, using an application is less stressful on the resources than launching at the same time. If your customer requires you to support a certain number of simultaneous launches, then you will have to over-provision a little bit to account for that. All right, so let's say you want to support 90 concurrent standard application sessions. 90 meaning that everyone's running them at the same time. You need one portal, which can be installed on the same server as the hub role. And you need 5 instances of our D4S V3 system. Since each system can support 20 concurrent users, this would give us coverage up to about 100 concurrent standard application sessions. Now, if you want to have 350 concurrent standard application sessions, you will have to set up 2 portal servers installed on separate servers from the hub. And since each application server of this level can support about 20 concurrent sessions, you need about 18 of them, which will cover up to 360 concurrent standard application sessions. Now, you don't have to use this D4S V3 system. We have had a customer set up a mega server, which is basically using 2 CPUs with, I think, 24 cores each, and hyper-threading, which basically doubles the number of cores through virtualization of the threads. And they use that to support, I think, about, how many is it? 200 to 300 users, or at least that would be their plan. So this is just general guidance. A useful tool to check your hardware capability is the test page on the workspace administration, which would allow you to launch a certain number of sessions at the same time. And this can be both specified on the same application server, or if you have multiple application server, if you select auto, it will spread out the launches across the application server, see if your environment can support the level that you expect. Firewall and networking. For the hub, it communicates over port 80 or 443. Unless you have a domain name specified for your turbo server, you will need to expose these ports from the hub externally. Same for the portal. For the application role, in addition to 80 and 443, depending on which protocol you have configured for your service, we also use 3389 and 5850. These are not required externally, which means that they should only be open between the system with the application role and the system with the portal role. And here is a diagram for the architecture. As you can see, the application servers communicate with the portal server over the RDP and RXP ports, and then everything else communicates over 443 or port 80, except for the database. The database communicates over port 1433 by default, and it needs to be open between the server systems. If your environment is not connected to the internet or is logged down, you can download the database component from our website, and then you would put it in to the Turbo Server installation directory. So substitute the Turbo Server installation directory with the hybrid workspaces variant, and then you would run the installer with the no database flag. And that will use the offline installation mode, so it doesn't try to download the database from our servers, which will fail if you don't have connection to our server to download the component from. Additionally, for lockdown environments, you may want to unblock the following URLs if you want to be able to pull images from the TurboNet hub. As an alternative, a customer can also download packages from the TurboNet hub from a different system using the Turbo client command line interface and push it to their Turbo server that way, if they don't want to open up their network to the hub addresses. The only conflict I've seen between Turbo server is when there's another server running on the same ports that Turbo server is specified to run on. Most commonly, this is IIS, which uses port 80 or port 443, and causes a problem where the Turbo server installation finishes, but then when the user goes to access the portal, they can't. And that happens because IIS has taken the port and Turbo server can't serve on it. So this concludes the installation requirements and sizing portion. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so there's one license for hub server. If they purchase application streaming, they replace that license with a hub server application streaming license. Is that correct?
Correct.
To enable the application streaming.
So you're asking if when they first install, are you asking about this license in here when they first install it?
But that license is put on the hub, is it? And you've got one hub.
Automatically.
Yes, it looks like your default license is only for the hub component, so it will not include application streaming. You'll need to send them a separate license with the application component as well.
And they replace it in after the install, typically.
Correct. Correct.
But if in the portal, if you then change the license, that license is associated to it's you just put the license in once, is it? You don't have to put multiple licenses on multiple servers.
It's only one license per turbo server environment or domain. So if you want to go change the license, you go to the administration portal. Under general, you would click the new license button to give the updated license here.
Thank you.
Another question: what's your experience with Windows 2021 yet as a backend server?
We have installed Turbo Server on it and found no issues. I believe it will be added to our standard testing suite soon. So everything should work as expected. It is based on Windows 10, so it shouldn't be a problem. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So let's do an install here. We have our hybrid workspaces server setup. Go ahead and click next, accept the EULA. I can use my pre-configured license for a 60-day trial. I'm going to use the default installation path. Let's say I want to use this. I use my default computer name as the URL. Does anyone know how to set up connection strings?
No, I was going to ask if that was kind of documented because that always eludes me. What's the right syntax?
Generally, you would specify the server or instance name depending on where the database is hosted. The initial catalog specifies the name of the database, and then you need a credential. Integrated security means that it uses the person who is logged in. That means if I double click the installer, I will be the user who will need access to the database to create and set it up. And then the service user will also need access to the database if we're using integrated security. An alternative is to specify credentials. So I can say user ID equals the username, and then password equals my password, like so, right? So in this case, since I specify the credential in my connection string, the service user doesn't need direct access to the database since all accesses will be handled by this credential. There is a useful website that you can check out. It's actually called connectionstrings.com. Then if you scroll down to SQL Server, you can see examples of different ways of specifying your connection strings. If you define your connection string correctly and it's still complaining that it doesn't work, you should ensure that you have configured the SQL Server correctly. That means enabling the TCP/IP ports, as well as opening the firewall ports so it doesn't block your communication with the server. So let's say, for example, for this database, I'm going to say on my local host, I'm going to leave my database name as configuration, and I'll use integrated security. For this one, and they can be both on the same server. So the same SQL Server can host multiple databases. I'm just giving you some examples here. This one, let's say it's in a separate server. I'm going to leave the database name as analytics, and I'll pass my credential, and it should work. In the service account, you typically specify the service account that has been created for the Turbo Server environment. If one hasn't been created, you can create a local account, but typically, if you're using local accounts, you'll need to specify the credential for the database in the connection string. Let's see. I'll use my local account for this case. Now specify an account and hybrid server will begin to install. As far as server installation, the setup process is actually pretty quick and painless compared to some other software that may require multiple hours of setup. So I've had a lot of customers comment about how easy it was to set up or how painless it was to set up, because typically when they install other enterprise server software, they hit multiple errors and troubleshooting issues that they need to cover. There we go. All right, so setup is complete. There will be a restart that will occur shortly. But let's see if we can add a sample application to the workspaces. Oops. Applications. Oh. All right. We haven't restarted yet. Probably run that locally. There's our application. There we go. Give it a moment here and be able to remote into the machine again. And I think I might have been incorrect about the licenses. It looks like the evaluation license that's pre-configured in the Micro Focus installer allows for streaming.
It
Out of the
does.
box.
Yeah.
Let's see, let me confirm that real quick. Yeah, it should be training. Takes a little bit of time for the service to come back online after a restart. I'll just go ahead and start it. Make it quicker. And this is what I mentioned over here. Well, once you install the RDS role, you have 120 days of a grace period before you have to configure it. Come on, there we go. Administrators. Oh. I have not started yet. I think the broker service is still starting up. That's why we're seeing this message. Let's see.
And you could check the admin console for what servers are online.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Oh, there it is. Oh, the second one. Okay. I think now should be getting further. The service is not licensed. That's not right. We're still within our grace periods. Anyways,
You're sure that's an RDS licensing?
that's what the error specifies. Yes.
Yeah, it's just a little small. Oh, right there it is. Thanks.
Yeah. Could be because the system is still starting up. I have to take a look into this.
Server should be listening on 3389 now, right?
No.
Oh, wait. No, it's a licensing issue. Never mind. Okay.
Yes, it's a licensing issue.
Yeah.
So I might have to double check the RDS licensing on this. Yeah, okay. I'll have to double check this. This is a new error that I haven't typically seen because we very clearly see that the server system indicates we have 119 days to set RDS up. And just as a reminder, for the next session, we'll be focusing on turbo server troubleshooting. As it will be recorded. You guys have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.